There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that wear the camouflage of routine so perfectly that you don't recognize their weight until much, much later. They are the quiet hinges on which the doors of your future swing open or shut. For me, one of those moments smelled of stale bus air conditioning, cheap motel soap still clinging to his skin, and the faint, clean scent of the laundry detergent he used. It was the precise moment Liam, exhausted after a regional track meet 3 states away, let his head fall against my shoulder. It wasn't a sudden, jarring thud, but a slow, deliberate surrender, a gradual giving way of tension until the full weight of his trust, his fatigue, and his unconsciousness rested against me. The world outside the tinted window was a blur of highway lights, a smear of sodium orange and halogen white against the deep indigo of a Midwestern night. Inside the bus, the only sounds were the hum of the engine, the whisper of the tires on asphalt, and the soft, even rhythm of Liam's breathing, a sound that seemed to sync not with my own breath, but with the frantic, hopeful beating of my heart. I sat there, a statue carved from equal parts terror and reverence, every nerve ending in my shoulder alight with a kind of painful, beautiful fire. This was just a teammate, I told myself, a friend, seeking the simple, thoughtless comfort of a stable surface on a long ride home. But the lie was thin, a threadbare sheet against the gale force of what I truly felt. This was Liam. And for me, nothing about him had ever been simple. We had orbited each other for 2 years before that night, two celestial bodies held in a careful, predictable pattern by the gravitational pull of the university's track and field team. I was the quiet observer, the team photographer, the one who existed on the periphery, my world framed by the viewfinder of a camera. My job was to capture moments of triumph and effort, to freeze the poetry of motion into a single, silent image. The grimace of a shot putter at the apex of his throw, the focused serenity of a high jumper suspended in midair, the raw, lung-burning exhaustion of a runner crossing the finish line. And then there was Liam. He was a long-distance runner, built lean and wiry, all sinew and grace. He wasn't the loudest guy on the team, not a boisterous captain who rallied the troops with speeches, but he possessed a different kind of magnetism. It was a quiet confidence, an easygoing warmth that drew people in without him ever seeming to try. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch, both on the track and off it, and he had a smile that could disarm a battalion. From the moment I first saw him, a freshman with an unruly mop of brown hair and eyes the color of warm honey, I had been silently, hopelessly, cataloging the details of him. Our friendship was forged in the liminal spaces of team travel. It was a relationship built on bus seats and cheap diner booths, on shared bags of pretzels and lukewarm Gatorade. He was the one who would always slide into the empty seat beside me on the long rides to away meets, filling the silence that I naturally cultivated with a stream of easy chatter. He'd talk about his classes, about a funny video he'd seen, about the intricate politics of his part-time job at a campus coffee shop. He never seemed to need me to say much in return. My quiet nods and occasional questions were enough. He simply seemed to enjoy the act of sharing his world, and for some reason I couldn't fathom, he had chosen me as his audience. I think, in the beginning, he saw me as a curiosity, the quiet guy with the camera, the one who saw everything but said little. He would lean over my shoulder as I scrolled through the day's photos on my laptop, pointing out a shot he liked, asking technical questions about aperture and shutter speed that I was always happy to answer. He had a genuine interest that went beyond simple politeness. He saw the art in what I did, not just the function, and that was a rare and precious thing. He'd say things like, "You made that look like a painting," or, "You can see exactly what he was thinking in that shot." He saw the stories I was trying to tell, and in doing so, he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't known I was missing. My feelings for him grew so slowly, so incrementally, that I barely noticed them taking root. They were like a vine creeping up a stone wall, a quiet, persistent green against the gray of my carefully ordered life. It started as simple admiration for his athleticism and his kindness. Then it deepened into a genuine affection for his humor and his open-hearted nature. And then, one day, I was sitting across from him in a fluorescent-lit Waffle House at 2 in the morning, watching the way he meticulously built a fortress of hash browns around his eggs, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't friendship. Not just friendship. It was a deep, resonant ache in the center of my chest, a yearning so profound it felt like a fundamental part of my own architecture. I loved him. The thought was terrifying, a wild animal uncaged in the quiet rooms of my mind. I immediately shoved it down, buried it under layers of practicality and self-preservation. He was my friend. He was a teammate. And he was, as far as I knew, completely and unequivocally straight. He had a long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a smart, kind biology major who sometimes came to our home meets. They were the perfect couple, easy and comfortable in each other's presence. To harbor feelings for him was not just pointless, it was a form of emotional self-destruction. So I became an expert in concealment. My camera became both my tool and my shield. Through its lens, I could stare at him for hours, studying the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck when it was damp with sweat, the sharp line of his jaw when he was focused, the spray of freckles across his nose that only appeared in the bright summer sun. I could capture these details, possess them in the form of digital files, without ever having to betray the truth of why I was looking so intently. My affection was laundered through the acceptable filter of my role. I was just doing my job. I was just getting the shot. The other guys on the team would joke about it sometimes. "Leo, you've got like 1,000 pictures of Liam. You building a shrine or something?" I'd laugh it off, saying, "He's just photogenic." Or, "Coach wants lots of action shots of the distance guys." They always accepted the excuse, because the alternative was unthinkable in the hypermasculine, heteronormative world of college athletics. And Liam, bless his unsuspecting heart, was my biggest champion. He'd see me aiming my lens at him and flash that easy grin, or even strike a goofy, exaggerated pose. He thought it was a running joke between us, a part of our dynamic. He had no idea that for me, every click of the shutter was a silent, unrequited declaration. It was a way of saying I see you in the only way I knew how, the only way I felt was safe. For 2 years, this was our equilibrium. A stable, predictable orbit. I was the silent moon to his radiant sun, content to reflect his light, to exist in his warmth without ever daring to get closer, terrified of burning up in his atmosphere. I watched him love someone else, and I learned to be happy for him, because his happiness was, in a strange way, a source of my own. Seeing him smile, even if I wasn't the cause of it, was enough. Or so I told myself. I compartmentalized my feelings, locking them in a room deep inside myself, a room I rarely visited. My friendship with him was too important to risk. He was one of the few people who had ever bothered to breach the walls I built around myself. He had walked into my quiet life and filled it with color and sound, and the thought of losing that, of being cast back into the monochrome silence, was more than I could bear. So I kept my secret safe. I nurtured our friendship like a rare and delicate plant, watering it with quiet attention and shared moments, and I pretended that it was all I would ever need. The shift began, as so many seismic changes do, with a crack in the foundation of someone else's world. It was the beginning of junior year, late September. The air was just starting to carry the crisp, melancholic edge of autumn. We were at an away meet in Ohio, and there was something off about Liam from the moment we got on the bus. The usual easy chatter was gone, replaced by a tense silence. He stared out the window, his jaw tight, his reflection a pale, unhappy ghost against the rolling hills. He had his headphones in, but I could tell he wasn't listening to anything. He was just using them as a shield, a polite do not disturb sign for the rest of the world. I didn't push. I had learned that about him. When he was truly troubled, he retreated into himself, and you had to let him come to you. He ran his race that weekend, a grueling 10,000-meter event, and he ran it poorly. He looked sluggish, his form was off, and he finished nearly a minute off his personal best. He crossed the finish line and just bent over, hands on his knees, his face a mask of disappointment and exhaustion. He didn't even look up when I took his picture. Later that night, most of the team went out to a local pizza place to celebrate a few victories, but Liam said he had a headache and was staying in the hotel. I found him an hour later, not in his room, but sitting on a concrete bench by the hotel's empty, leaf-strewn swimming pool. The air was cool, and he was just in a t-shirt and shorts, hugging his knees to his chest. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but the sight of him looking so lost, so small under the harsh glare of the hotel security lights, pulled me forward. I sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful, respectful distance between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just listened to the distant sound of traffic on the interstate and the hum of the pool filter. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "Sarah and I broke up. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, man." Felt hollow and inadequate. So I just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. He let out a long, shaky breath. It was mutual, I guess. As much as these things can be. We just want different things. She's talking about grad school in California, and I don't know what I'm doing. We've been together since high school. It just felt like we were growing in two completely different directions. Like we were holding on just because it was familiar. He picked at a loose thread on his shorts. It still feels like having a limb amputated, you know? Even if it was a limb that was starting to hurt all the time. I understood that feeling more than he could ever know. The pain of letting go of something that has become a part of your identity. I thought about the feelings I had for him, a part of me that I had carried for so long it felt like a vital organ. What would it feel like to have that removed? "It's okay to be a mess about it," I said, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. "It's a big deal." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were glistening under the fluorescent lights. He offered a small, sad smile. "Yeah, I know. It just sucks." He looked away again, back at the dark, still water of the pool. "Everything feels untethered." That was the word that stuck with me. Untethered. That was exactly how he seemed in the weeks that followed. He was a ship that had slipped its moorings, drifting on an unseen current. His easy confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet restlessness. He was still Liam, of course. He still laughed at the other guys' jokes, still put in the miles at practice, still functioned. But the light in him had dimmed. It was like watching a vibrant photograph slowly fade in the sun. He started spending more time alone, but it wasn't the comfortable, restorative solitude that I enjoyed. It was a lonely, agitated kind of isolation. And it was during this time that he started to lean on me, not just figuratively, but literally. It began on the next bus trip, 2 weeks after the breakup. It was the trip where he first fell asleep on my shoulder. Before that night, he had always been a restless bus sleeper, shifting and turning, trying to get comfortable against the unyielding window. But that night, it was different. He sat down next to me, said a quiet, "Hey," and then spent the first hour of the ride staring out at the darkness, just as he had before. Then, I felt a slight pressure against my arm. I glanced over. He had tilted his head back against the seat, his eyes closed, but the gentle sway of the bus kept nudging his head towards me. For a few minutes, it was a delicate dance of proximity, his head tapping lightly against my shoulder with every turn in the road. I held my breath, my entire body rigid. Then, with a soft sigh, he gave into it. He let his head settle fully against me, his hair brushing against my cheek. My first instinct was to flinch, to pull away, to preserve the careful boundary I had maintained for so long. But I couldn't. The sheer, unadulterated exhaustion radiating from him was a palpable force. It felt less like a conscious choice on his part, and more like an involuntary act of seeking comfort, like a plant turning towards the sun. So I stayed still, my muscles aching with the effort of not moving, and let him sleep. It was the longest 4 hours of my life. Every part of my brain was screaming at me, a cacophony of panic and elation. This means nothing. He's just tired. Don't read into it. Don't you dare hope. But my heart, that foolish, stubborn organ, was humming a different tune. It was a quiet song of possibility, a melody I hadn't allowed myself to hear in years. That night established the new ritual. From then on, every bus trip was the same. Liam would take the seat next to me, and at some point, Usually after the sun went down and the interior of the bus became a dim, intimate space, he would fall asleep on my shoulder. It was never discussed. We never acknowledged it. The next morning, he would wake up as the bus pulled into our destination, stretch, and say something like, "Man, I slept like a rock," with no mention of where his head had been. And I would just nod, my own body stiff from hours of immobility, and say, "Good. You looked like you needed it." The plausible deniability of it all was excruciating. For him, it was likely nothing more than a comfortable pillow. But for me, it was everything. It was a secret intimacy, a stolen closeness that I both craved and dreaded. I would sit for hours, inhaling the scent of his shampoo, feeling the warmth of him seeping through my sweatshirt, the soft tickle of his hair against my neck. I learned the rhythm of his sleeping breath, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch in a dream. It was a kind of torture to be this close to what I wanted most, and to know that it was almost certainly an illusion, a mirage created by his exhaustion and my own desperate hope. The ritual soon began to expand beyond the confines of the bus. We started having more overnight stays in hotels for bigger meets. The team would usually be paired up, two to a room. I always requested a single room if possible, citing my need to edit photos late into the night without disturbing anyone. It was an excuse that gave me a welcome bubble of solitude. But now, Liam, who was usually rooming with another runner named Mark, started finding reasons to be in my room. It would start with a knock on the adjoining door that connected our rooms. "Hey Leo, you got any ibuprofen? My knee is killing me." Or, "Can I borrow your laptop charger? I think I left mine at home." But then he would linger. He'd sit on the end of my bed and we'd talk, or he'd ask if he could watch whatever movie I had on my laptop. The first time it happened, we were watching some dumb action movie, and I looked over to see that he had fallen asleep, propped up against the headboard of my bed, his chin on his chest. I watched him for a long time, the way the soft hotel lamplight traced the curve of his cheekbone. I didn't have the heart to wake him and send him back to his own room. So I just turned off the movie, dimmed the lights, and went to sleep in my own bed, leaving him there. I woke up around dawn to find him gone. He'd slipped back into his own room at some point in the night. He didn't mention it the next day. And just like on the bus, it happened again. And again, it became another unspoken part of our routine. Each time, a new layer of anxiety was added to my fragile composure. I was living in a state of constant, heightened awareness. My entire world had shrunk to the space of a bus seat, the square footage of a generic hotel room. I was an anthropologist studying a tribe of two, meticulously documenting and analyzing every gesture, every word, every silence. When he rested his hand on the bed, mere inches from my own, was he aware of the proximity? When he laughed at something I said and his shoulder brushed against mine, was it accidental? I was drowning in ambiguity, and the worst part was, I couldn't ask for a life raft. To ask, "What does this mean?" would be to shatter the delicate, unspoken truce that allowed this intimacy to exist. It would force him to confront something he possibly wasn't even aware he was doing, and the likely outcome would be a hurried, embarrassed retreat. He would pull away, the boundaries would be re-established with thick, impenetrable walls, and I would lose not only this fragile closeness but the friendship that was its foundation. So I said nothing. I lived on the knife's edge of hope and fear, cherishing these moments of borrowed intimacy while simultaneously being tormented by them. I was a starving man being allowed to look at a feast through a pane of glass. His presence began to feel like a physical law in my life, like gravity or the rising of the sun. The silence we shared was no longer empty. It was filled with a low-frequency hum of unspoken things. We developed a shorthand, a nonverbal language. A slight tilt of my head was an invitation for him to rest his. A soft nudge from him was a request for me to turn up the volume on the headphones we were now sharing, one earbud for each of us, a thin white wire connecting us in the dark. He was slowly, methodically, breaking down all of my defenses, not with force, but with a quiet, persistent need that I was powerless to deny. He was untethered, and he had, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, chosen me as his anchor. And I was terrified that the rope would snap, or that he would one day realize he was tied to the wrong post altogether. My camera roll from that autumn tells the story better than my words ever could. The pictures of him on the track are still there, full of motion and strain. But they are interspersed with quieter moments I captured without thinking. Liam, asleep on the bus, his face peaceful in the morning light slanting through the window. Liam, staring into a cup of coffee in a diner, a thoughtful, melancholy expression on his face. Liam, laughing at something one of the other guys said, but his eyes, if you look closely, not quite reaching the same level of joy as his mouth. I wasn't just the team photographer anymore. I had become his personal biographer, documenting the subtle shifts in his emotional weather, charting the course of his lonely drift. And all the while, I was drifting right alongside him, caught in the same quiet current. The breaking point, or perhaps the breaking open point, came in early November at the conference championships in Illinois. It was the most important meet of the season, the one that determined our standing for the national qualifiers. The pressure was immense, and no one felt it more than Liam. His performance all season had been inconsistent, a direct reflection of his emotional state. He was running on fumes, both physically and mentally. I could see the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders were permanently tensed. He was trying to outrun the ghost of his breakup, the uncertainty of his future, but it was catching up to him with every lap. His race, the 5,000-meter, was late in the afternoon. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray, and a cold, biting wind whipped across the track. He started out strong, holding a steady pace with the lead pack, but I could see the strain on his face from the first lap. It wasn't the usual look of focused determination. It was a desperate, haggard expression. Around the halfway mark, he started to fall back. I watched through my long lens as his form began to crumble, his stride shortening, his arms flailing slightly. It was painful to watch. He finished 7th. Not a disaster, but a deep disappointment for him. Well below his own expectations and likely not good enough to secure a spot at nationals. He didn't talk to anyone after the race. He just collected his gear, his face pale and grim, and disappeared into the locker room. When I saw him later, on the bus back to the hotel, he looked utterly defeated. He slumped into the seat beside me and immediately put his head against the window, closing himself off. This time, he didn't drift towards my shoulder. He kept a rigid, deliberate distance, a wall of cold glass between us. The silence was heavy, brittle. It felt different from our usual comfortable quiet. This was a silence born of shame and disappointment. Back at the hotel, the mood was subdued. Liam bypassed the usual team dinner, saying he wasn't hungry, and went straight to his room. I knew he was rooming with Mark again, and I could only imagine how isolating it must feel to have to put on a brave face for a roommate when all you want to do is crumble. I went to my own single room, showered, and tried to edit some photos, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting to the room next door. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of their television, but nothing else. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock, not on my hallway door, but on the adjoining one. I opened it. Liam stood there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and flannel pants, and his hair was a mess. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Is Mark in there?" I asked, confused. "No, he went out with some of the other guys. To get food." He wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on a spot on the carpet. Can I come in for a bit?" "It's too quiet in there, of course," I said, stepping back to let him pass. He walked into the room and just stood in the middle of it, looking lost. He seemed like a ghost, haunting the space between the two double beds. I didn't know what to do, what to say. The usual script of our ritual felt inadequate for the depth of his despair. So I just went and sat on the edge of my bed, waiting for him to give me a cue. He eventually drifted over and sat on the other bed, facing me, his back against the headboard. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the hum of the heater. "I really messed up today," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You were tired," I offered gently. "It's been a long season, it's not just that," he said, shaking his head. "My head is just, it's not in the right place. Hasn't been for months. I feel like I'm running in place, in every part of my life." running and running and getting absolutely nowhere. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a raw, desperate vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. My heart ached for him. All the analysis, all the fear and hope that had been churning inside me for months, it all just evaporated, replaced by a simple, overwhelming need to offer him some kind of comfort, some solid ground in his spinning world. I wanted to cross the space between the beds, to sit next to him, to put an arm around his shoulder, but I was frozen by years of self-enforced restraint. He seemed to sense my hesitation, my internal conflict. His gaze was so intense, so searching. It felt like he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the things we had never said. The silence was no longer a comfortable blanket. It was a taut, vibrating wire. Then he broke it. His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Leo. Yeah. My own voice was a croak. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His eyes never left mine. Would it be okay? He trailed off, as if the words themselves were too heavy to lift. He took a breath and started again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The humming of the heater, the distant traffic, the frantic beating of my own heart. It all went silent. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for my answer. My mind raced, trying to process the question. Was this real? Was he delirious with exhaustion and disappointment? Was this some kind of misguided attempt to feel something, anything, to distract himself from his failure on the track? 1,000 doubts and fears screamed through me. But then I looked at his face, at the genuine, terrifying vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't a whim. This was a confession. This was him, untethered and lost, finally pointing to the harbor he thought might be safe. And in that moment, I knew that whatever the consequences, whatever the fallout, the only possible answer was the truth. The only possible answer was yes. I didn't say the word. I couldn't. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if crossing a minefield. He slid off his bed and knelt on the floor in the space between us. He placed a hand gently on my knee, a silent question, asking for permission to continue. His hand was warm, slightly calloused, and it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just watched him as he leaned in, his face illuminated by the single lamp I had on. His eyes were closed. He was giving me every possible chance to stop him, to pull away. But I didn't want to. I had wanted this for so long, in the quietest, most secret corners of my heart, that its arrival felt both shocking and inevitable, like a thunderstorm on a humid day. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was soft. It was unbelievably gentle. It tasted of salt and sadness and a desperate, unspoken need. It was a question, an apology, and a plea, all at once. It lasted only a few seconds, but it rearranged my entire universe. He pulled back slowly, his hand still on my knee, and opened his eyes. He looked just as stunned as I felt. Okay, he whispered, more to himself than to me, as if he had just confirmed a scientific theory he'd been afraid to test. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of relief and sheer terror. And then, without another word, he stood up, turned, and walked back through the adjoining door into his own room, closing it softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. I was left alone, sitting on the edge of my bed, my lips tingling, my world irrevocably, terrifyingly, beautifully changed. The next morning was a nightmare of agonizing silence. I barely slept, my mind replaying that single, earth-shattering moment over and over again. I felt like I had touched a live wire. When I finally drifted off, I woke up an hour later convinced I had dreamed it all. But the faint, phantom pressure of his lips on mine, the memory of his terrified eyes, told me it was real. I saw him at the complimentary continental breakfast. He was with Mark and a few other guys, laughing at something, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. He looked normal. He glanced in my direction once. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and then he looked away, his expression unreadable. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. He was pretending it didn't happen. On the bus ride home, he walked right past my empty seat. He didn't even hesitate. He went to the back of the bus and sat with two of the sprinters, immediately getting drawn into a loud, boisterous conversation about a football game. The seat next to me remained empty for the entire 6-hour drive. It felt like a vast, gaping wound. I felt sick. I had misinterpreted everything. His vulnerability last night wasn't a confession of hidden feelings for me. It was a symptom of his own emotional chaos. He was lost, and in a moment of desperation, he had reached for the nearest solid object, me. And now, in the clear, harsh light of day, he was filled with regret. The shame was so intense I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had allowed myself to hope, and that hope had been a catastrophic mistake. The week that followed was one of the worst of my life. Liam avoided me with a surgical precision. At practice, he'd find reasons to be on the other side of the track. If he saw me in the dining hall, he'd abruptly change direction. He didn't answer the one text I sent him, a casual, "Hey, you good?" The silence was his answer. He was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick, and I was forced to stand by and watch. The other guys on the team didn't seem to notice. To them, we were just two teammates who sometimes sat together on the bus. But for me, his absence was a physical presence, a ghost sitting in the empty chair beside me, a constant reminder of my own foolishness. I was hurt, but more than that, I was angry. I was angry at him for being a coward, for initiating something so profound and then running from it like a frightened child. But mostly, I was angry at myself for letting my guard down, for allowing that one fragile moment of hope to bloom. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him, even if it was the worst possible news. I needed the finality of a closed door. I found him after practice on Friday, in the deserted weight room. He was sitting on a bench, slowly unwrapping the tape from his ankles, his shoulders slumped. He didn't see me until I was standing right in front of him. He flinched, his head snapping up, and for a second, he looked like a cornered animal. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was steady, much calmer than I felt. He wouldn't look at me. He just kept his eyes on his hands, fumbling with the sticky tape. "I'm busy, Leo. I got to study for a midterm." "No," I said, my voice firmer this time. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to open a door like that and then pretend the whole house doesn't exist. You owe me more than that." He finally dropped the tape and looked up at me, his face a mess of conflict and misery. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to say the truth," I said, my voice cracking slightly despite my best efforts. "I want you to tell me that it was a mistake, that you were confused and lonely, and that it didn't mean anything. Just say it, so I can move on. Because this silence is killing me, Liam." He stared at me, his jaw working, as if he were chewing on the words, trying to find the right ones. He looked down at his hands again, then back at me. A tear slid down his cheek, and he angrily wiped it away. "I can't," he whispered. "You can't what?" I asked, my frustration mounting. "You can't tell me the truth?" "I can't tell you it didn't mean anything," he said, his voice choked. "Because that would be a lie." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "God, Leo, I'm so sorry. I'm so scared. I don't know what's happening." And just like that, all my anger dissipated, replaced by that same, familiar ache of compassion. I sat down on the bench next to him, leaving a small space between us. He didn't pull away. "What are you scared of?" I asked softly. He took a long, shuddering breath before answering. "Everything. What this means. What people would think. What I think. I've never felt like this about a guy before. It doesn't make any sense. My whole life, I've had this plan, this idea of who I am. A girlfriend, a wife, a family. It was all laid out. And then," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely between us. "And then you, me?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You," he confirmed, finally looking at me again. His eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. "For months, ever since Sarah, you've been the only person I feel safe with. The only person I can be quiet with. I don't have to perform for you. I don't have to be the happy, easygoing guy. I can just be. And on the bus, in the hotels. I wasn't just tired, Leo. I was. I was seeking you out. It was the only time all week I felt like I could actually breathe. And I didn't understand why. I kept telling myself it was just because you're a good friend. He let out a humorless laugh. But then, in the hotel room the other night, looking at you, seeing you look at me, I just knew. It wasn't just friendship. And it terrified me. So I ran. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest, and utterly transformative. He had been just as confused, just as scared as I was. We had been two people speaking the same silent language without realizing the other could understand. I've had feelings for you for a long time, I admitted, the words feeling both momentous and ridiculously simple now that they were finally spoken. For years, he just stared at me, his expression softening from fear into a kind of wondering awe. You have. I nodded. I just never thought. I never imagined you could ever feel the same way. Me neither, he whispered. A small, tentative smile touched his lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. So, what does this mean? I don't know, I said honestly. But maybe we could figure it out together. He looked at my hand, which was resting on the bench between us. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and covered it with his own. His touch was no longer accidental or ambiguous. It was a choice. A deliberate, terrifying, wonderful choice. Okay, he said, his voice steadier now. Yeah, I'd like that. We started over. Not from the beginning, but from that new, honest place we had carved out in the quiet of the weight room. It was slow. It was careful. We were two people learning a new language, fumbling with the grammar of a different kind of intimacy. The rituals returned, but they were transformed. On the next bus trip, to a small indoor meet a few hours away, he sat next to me without hesitation. There was a moment of shared, nervous energy as we sat down, a silent acknowledgement that this time was different. About an hour into the ride, he didn't fall asleep. He just leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder, fully awake, and then he took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. It wasn't a gesture born of exhaustion anymore. It was a statement, a quiet declaration for an audience of two. I looked down at our joined hands, at the way his fingers fit so perfectly between mine, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that replaced all the anxious turmoil. This was real. The hotel rooms changed, too. We started requesting to be roommates. There was no more pretext of watching a movie or borrowing a charger. He would just come and sit on my bed while I edited photos, and we would talk for hours. We talked about everything and nothing. About his fears, about my hopes, about our families, about our dreams for the future that were suddenly, excitingly, starting to intertwine. We were relearning each other, seeing the familiar outlines of our friendship now filled in with new colors, new depths. The physical affection was tentative at first, a hand on the small of my back as we walked through a crowded lobby, his leg resting against mine as we sat on the floor of the hotel room, eating takeout pizza. And there were more kisses. They were no longer born of desperation, but of a growing, gentle affection. They were quiet, exploratory, and they always left me feeling grounded, as if I'd finally found my own true north. We didn't tell anyone on the team, not at first. Not because we were ashamed, but because what we were building felt fragile, a delicate glass sculpture that we needed to protect from the outside world. It was ours. It existed in the bubble of our shared bus seats, our hotel rooms, the quiet corners of campus where we'd meet between classes. It was a secret world we were creating together, and for now, that was enough. My camera, which had once been my shield, became a new kind of tool. I was still the team photographer, but now when I took pictures of Liam, there was a different intent behind the lens. I was no longer just a secret admirer, but a partner. I was capturing the moments of his return to himself. I took a photo of him after he won his first race of the indoor season, a wide grin splitting his face, his eyes bright and clear, and in that photo, I saw the man I was falling in love with, not the ghost he had been. When I showed it to him later, he wrapped his arms around me and just held me, burying his face in my neck. "You always see me," he whispered. Even when I can't see myself, we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. His restlessness began to subside, replaced by a calm that I had never seen in him before. And my own long-held loneliness, the quiet ache I had carried for so long, began to recede, replaced by the steady, comforting warmth of his presence. We found our rhythm, a new kind of orbit that was no longer defined by distance and yearning, but by a shared center of gravity. It wasn't a dramatic, sweeping romance. It was something quieter, deeper, and more profound. It was the peace of knowing that at the end of a long, grueling day, there was a safe harbor waiting. It was the simple, unspoken understanding in a shared glance across a crowded room. It was the feeling of his head on my shoulder on a long bus ride home, not as a desperate search for comfort, but as a simple, contented act of coming home. We were just two teammates on the road, but every mile we traveled together was no longer a journey of uncertainty, but a map leading us closer to a destination we were finally, bravely, choosing for ourselves.